Hey guys, so I wanted to continue part two of the video. So part one was just labeling all of the blocks. So we labeled the S block in purple, and that includes helium over there on the right-hand side above those noble gases. We also labeled the P block in blue, and then we labeled the infamous D block in red, and then the F block down at the bottom has been labeled in green. So what I want to do is I want to continue on to part two of the video. And part two of the video is basically going back and going through all of these blocks, but we are going to have the elements involved. All right. So you should have a copy of your periodic table that you started with part one. I want to go on and move on to part two. So the first thing that we're going to do for part two is we are going to basically mirror the labeling that we did in part one, okay? So for part one, I'm gonna make sure that I keep the colors consistent, all right, just so we can all be on the same page. So for part one, I labeled the S block, and the S block was labeled in purple. So I'm gonna do the same on here and label it in purple. And I'm gonna make sure that I don't forget my friend helium up here. That is part of the S block. Okay, so that should be the first thing that you are doing is making sure that you have that label in the proper place. All right, so that would be the S block here in purple. The second block that I'm going to label is the P block, and I believe in the last video we labeled it in a blue, so I'm going to keep it the same, just so we can all be on the same page, right? And all of your labels should look exactly the same as the ones that I'm drawing right now, okay? And then this would be considered the P block. I'm gonna put it right here on top of this section right here, okay? So it will be the P block. All right, the third section that I'm gonna label is what I always call that infamous D block. And I don't know why I always end up putting it in red, but I'm gonna label it in red as usual. That's what I labeled it on your last sheet, so that's what I'm gonna label it on this. And then, of course, last but not least is going to be the D block, and I believe we labeled that in green. So we're gonna keep that consistent, and I'm gonna label that right down here at the bottom in green. All right, so now we have another set of labeling to do, right? We are going to need to label each individual row in the periodic table. So to do that, I'm going to do it in black. So hopefully it'll show up a little bit better on that background. So the numbers that you should be putting on your periodic table, we're going to start with the S block. The S block starts with 1, and then we go to 2, and then 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And what I'm going to do, just to make it a little bit easier for you guys to see the numbers, I'm actually going to get rid of the lines where the numbers might overlap, okay? But you'll still be able to see the line above, but I want you guys to be able to see the numbers that I'm drawing in. All right, so once again, we'll go back to our black pen and we will continue numbering. So in the P block, we are going to start with 2, and then we are going to move on to 3. So we have 2, 3, and then right here is 4, 5, 6, and 7. All right, so for the D block, let's label the D block. I'm gonna put it on the line right between calcium and scandium. So we start with 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so your numbers should look exactly like my numbers. And then the last 2 that we need to label is gonna be the F block, right? So the F block is always labeled with a 4 and a 5. Okay, and I realized that I guess kind of ignored labeling all the other blocks, but this should be the same from the last video and drawing that we did, but I'll put them in there just so that we can be all on the same page. Okay, so now everything has been labeled with the numbers that we need. And what I want to do is I want to basically show you how UFBA figured which one was the lowest orbital and which one was the highest orbital. And you can figure that out just by walking the periodic table. So that's what we're going to do. Okay, so when you're reading the periodic table, you're always going to read the periodic table from left to right, and you'll start in the top left corner. And what I'm going to do is whatever number that we run into, I'm going to write down the number. And then whatever block we're in, I'm going to write down the block. Okay? So here we go. We're going to start in the top left corner, right here where this arrow is. The first number that I run into is 1. So I'm going to write 1. Okay, we're going to run through the S block. So we're going to run through hydrogen and helium. So that would be 1s. Once we get through there, we are on the other side of helium. And then just like we would if we were reading a book, we're going to start over. So we're going to start right here. The next number that I run into is going to be 2. And I'm still in that S block, so I'm going to write S. Now, as I make my way across the periodic table, the next number that I run into is this 2. So I'm going to write 2. And now guess what? I'm in the P block. So I'm going to write 2P. And now I am on the other side of the P block. All right, just like when you read in a book, you're going to start over. So the next number that I run into is going to be 3. So I'm going to write 3. And I am still in that S block, so I'm going to write S. Just like we did before, we're going to make our way across the periodic table. The next number that I run into is going to be 3, and we are back in the P block. So I'm going to put a P right there. That brings us on the other side of the P block. All right, so now we're going to start over again at the left side of the periodic table. The next number that we run into is going to be 4. So I'm going to put a 4 here, and we are still in that S block. So potassium and calcium are still part of the S block. So I'm going to write S. So now I don't have to go very far until I run into my next number, and it's right here. So I'm going to write 3. And now we have crossed into that infamous D block. So I'm going to write 3D. Keep going across the periodic table. The next number that you run into is going to be 4. So write down 4. And then guess what? I have popped back into the P block. So I'm going to put 4P. And now I'm on the other side of the P block. Then we're going to start all over again on the left side of the periodic table. The number that I run into is going to be 5. So I'm going to write 5. Rubidium and strontium are part of the S block. So I'm going to write S. And then the next number that I run into is going to be this number right here, which is 4. And then guess what? I'm back into that infamous D block. So I'm going to put D here. Keep going across the periodic table. The next number that you run into is going to be 5. And we are back in the P block. So I'm going to put a P right there. And now we are on the other side of the periodic table. Okay, so let's start again on the left side. All right, so the first number that we run into is going to be 6. So I'm going to put 6 here. Cesium and barium are both in the S block, so I'm going to write S. Now here's where it gets a little interesting. When we get to this block here, basically it looks like it's blank, which it is. This block tells you when you get here, you need to make your way down to the lanthanide series. Okay, that's what that says right there. So when you get down there, the first number that you're going to run into is going to be 4. And now we have popped into the F block. So now it's 4F. And now we're at the end of the F block. Now what happens is once you get to the end of the F block, if you look, that's element 71, right? So the next element is going to be 72, but you have to go back into the main periodic table to get there. Okay, so now we are back into the main body of the periodic table. The first number that you will hit is 5, and we are back in the D block. We go all the way across the D block. The next number that we hit is number 6, So we're going to put a 6 here, and now we're back in the P block. So I'm going to put a P here, and we made it all the way across the periodic table. All right, so what I'm going to do is, just to make things a little bit easier, I'm going to get rid of some of these lines so that when we get around here again, you guys don't get confused about what direction you should go in. Okay, so now we are going to do what we've done before. Okay, we are going to start over on the left side of the periodic table. So here we are. The next number that we run into is 7. And then we are at francium and radium. They are in the S block, so I'm going to write S. Guess what? When we get here, same situation happens. It says when you get here, you need to go down here to the actinide series. So the first number that we run into is going to be 5, right down here. So we're going to write 5. And then guess what? We are back in that F block. So I'm going to put 5F. And now we've gotten here to the end. When we get to the end of the 5F block, it's the same situation that we had before. The periodic table basically tells you you need to go back to the main body of the periodic table. Okay. So now once we have looped back around to the main body of the periodic table, the number that we run into is going to be 6. So I'm going to write 6. I'm back in that D block, so I'm going to put D. The next number that I run into is going to be 7, and I'm going to write 7. And now I am back in the P block. And guess what? We are done. So this should look very familiar to you guys in terms of Aufbau's principle, right? So Aufbau said that basically when we look at the different orbitals, we're going to range in energy, and there is an order from lowest to highest. So here's what I want to do. I want you guys to take a look at your notes that we did on Aufbau, and I would like you to follow along with me in your notes. And if I have walked the periodic table correctly, they should be arranged from lowest to highest. So on your notes, you should see 1s should be first. Then it should be 2s, and then 2p, and then 3s, and then 3p, and then we have 4s, which should move on to 3d, which then moves on to 4p, which leads us to 5s. The next one should be 4d, then after that should be 5p, and then the next one should be 6s, and then 4f, 5d, 6p, 7s, 5f, 6d, and 7p. So if I walked my periodic table correctly, and while you guys were hopefully following along with me, this is the order of your orbitals from lowest to highest. Okay, so this is how you can use the periodic table to basically justify Aufbau. Okay, and it's also a way that you can figure out what orbital is next in the series of orbitals for your orbital diagrams and your electron configurations. I hope that was helpful. Bye.